The Catholic or Counter-Reformation is dated from approximately 1545 to 1648, give or take. In reality, the Catholic, also known as the Counter-Reformation, resulted worldwide, but it started and is mainly centered in Europe at that same time. So we know the when, we know the where. Now, what about the what? Well, to consider the what, you need to think about Newton's third law of motion. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Think about what's been happening to Europe since 1517 when Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the church door. Europe had been rocked by all sorts of new Protestant movements, from the Lutherans in Germany to the Calvinists in Switzerland, France, and scattered throughout the rest of Europe, and Henry VIII switching all of England over to the Anglican Church. By 1600, the map of Europe was very different, with Lutheranism, Calvinism, and Anglicanism coming to power in various pockets of Europe. The Catholic Church was losing some of its influence and some of its authority. This had to change, at least as far as the Church was concerned. Therefore, the Reformation is the Catholic or Counter-Reformation is the Catholic response to the Protestant movements, the reaction to Protestant actions. So, how exactly did this take place? Well, it happened in a number of ways. First, new religious orders were established. One of the most famous was the one founded by this fellow here. This is Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits. The Jesuits were an order of priests and monks who specialized in spreading the Catholic faith by doing two things. First, they did missionary work in foreign lands. The 1500s was the time when Europeans were exploring new territories in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. And everywhere European settlers went, particularly from Catholic countries like France and Spain, the Jesuits usually followed, hoping to convert the natives into Catholics for the church. The other task of the Jesuits was providing schools and universities to provide education not only in traditional subjects, but also from a religious viewpoint as well. If you're familiar with schools such as Notre Dame in Indiana, Boston College, Holy Cross, and others, those are all founded by the Jesuits. In this way, they spread the Catholic message far beyond Europe and took it global. If the Jesuits took the Catholic faith worldwide and interacted with the outside world, Teresa of Avila went in the opposite direction. When she reformed the order of Carmelite nuns, she did so after an incident in which she said she had been visited by an angel in a dream who had pierced her side with an arrow. This persuaded her to retreat into a stricter following of Catholic teaching. She and her nuns focused on prayer and meditation and took vows of poverty and seclusion. In other words, focusing solely on their religion and their personal practice of it. Where the Jesuits carried their message into the larger world, the Carmelites focused inward on their own salvation and their own faith. Another way in which the Counter-Reformation happened was through the Inquisition. The Inquisition had been around for a while and consisted of special church courts of sorts that were set up to punish heretics, those who challenged the traditional thinking of the church. Some of these inquisitions were held for religious reasons, but others were caught up in it as well. In probably one of the most famous cases, the astronomer Galileo, shown here in the center, was forced to face the Inquisition for his controversial, at that time, views that the sun was in fact the center of the universe and that the planets moved around it. Galileo ended up being placed under house arrest, which, in a sense, allowed him to escape pretty free. Some of the penalties for the Inquisition would include excommunication, being in effect kicked out of the church, and denied a chance to get salvation and a place in heaven, according to church teaching. In some cases, the church also confiscated lands of heretics. In the case of Galileo, he was placed under house arrest for the remainder of his life, and that was after being forced to recant or basically deny his scientific theories. In extreme cases, heretics could be tortured and even killed, often by burning at the stake, such as you see in this artwork here. Probably the most famous version of the Inquisition took place in Spain between the years of 1478 and 1834, during which time thousands of so-called heretics were tortured and killed. If you've read the Edgar Allan Poe story, The Pit and the Pendulum, the protagonist of that story is, in fact, a subject of the Inquisition. Another way in which the Catholics attempted to counter Protestant ideas was creating the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, translated, the Index of Forbidden Books. One way to keep Catholic ideas prominent was to stop Protestant ideas from spreading, therefore, the list of forbidden books. As you might expect, a lot of religious thinkers and authors were on this list. Obviously, some of Luther's works would have been there, as would some of John Calvin's. However, the index doesn't include just religious books and religious thinkers. Scientists and philosophers were also banned according to the index. For example, Niccolo Machiavelli had a number of his works banned, as did the English scientist and philosopher Francis Bacon, whom we'll learn about in a later unit. Another English philosopher, John Locke, whom you're probably familiar with as the thinker behind some of the ideas in our Declaration of Independence, had some of his works in the index, as did the French thinker Voltaire, who wrote extensively about free speech and other individual rights. But the champion of champions in the index has to be the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who again we'll discuss in a later unit. Every one of Hobbes' published works somehow made its way into the index. He wrote extensively on politics, and I'm not sure why all of his stuff went in. Perhaps we can look at that in a future unit. The index actually outlasted the Counter-Reformation. Started in 1559, the index was in existence until 1966, over 400 years, and during that time, upwards of 4,000 titles were added to the list. The index was one of the actions of a series of meetings called the Council of Trent, which started in 1545 and is considered the beginning of the Catholic Reformation. As it says here, it's a series of meetings of various Catholic leaders as a response to the Protestant movements. The council was called by Pope Julius III. And as a result of these meetings, some changes were actually put into place. For example, and this is a big one, the sale of indulgences was banned. You may remember that was one of Luther's original concerns or subjects of the 95 Theses. The council also required that bishops had to live in the areas that they were responsible for. This did away with the practice of pluralism, where priests and bishops would focus on richer dioceses rather than ones closer to home. The council also condemned the practice of clergy having mistresses. From this point on, the priestly vow of celibacy, not to get married, was going to be taken seriously. Some things, of course, stayed the same. The church continued to say that salvation equals faith and good works. Luther's idea of faith alone, sola fide, was no longer acceptable. The church remained as the ultimate interpreter of Scripture. They stood as the final authority on what the Bible meant. And most of the traditional practices, including the sacraments, were reaffirmed as necessary to become saved. The Catholic Church wasn't going to go away, and even today, roughly half of the world's Christians are Roman Catholic. However, the Catholic Church was definitely only one of Christian movements that were streaking across Europe and the world, as this map shows. And the effects of that Reformation and Counter-Reformation, actions and reactions, will last for a long time.